Please welcome Robert Asch. It's a great pleasure to have you here, Robert.
Thank you. Right. Well, this is going to be a talk with some fairly dense material in it, so I'm going to read it, and I'll engage with you as as especially in the question period afterwards, as you want to. But in any case, it's an honor as well as a pleasure to be here to do what I can to rebut a distressing and serious charge against a man whose writings changed my life. Anne Farmer has done a tremendous job in her exhaustive book, Chesterton and the Jews, which is on sale in the corridor. And I'm in her debt, including at numerous points in this talk, but I hope to offer several angles which seem to me largely unexplored to date. When Chesterton died in 1936, he was a greatly beloved figure throughout the English-speaking world and beyond, including in Jewish circles, admired by such disparate writers as H.G. Wells, T.S. Eliot, and Franz Kafka. He had lately gained a reputation of being, with Churchill, the most strident and persistent critic of Nazi Germany, and was posthumously quoted twice on the front page of the Times in the darkest days of the Blitz. At different points in his career, he had praised the Jews as a noble and unique and historic people, and yet, from about the 1980s, significantly as those with living memories of Chesterton or his times began to disappear, he was increasingly accused of anti-Semitism, often, though not always, by those hostile to Orthodox Catholicism or traditional morality. As I implied above, I believe this charge to be false, but the issue is complex and cannot merely be laughed away as could, say, some wild accusation that he secretly despised France or the novels of Charles Dickens. And I shall attempt to identify and analyze those elements of his thought and writing and era which have given rise to the mistaken charge of anti-Semitism. Given the momentous subject of this talk, I was torn as to how best to proceed. It seemed to me that what was needed is as simple and direct a refutation as possible. But what is very nearly as important, I believe, is an explanation of why Chesterton has been wrongly accused. One difficulty is that a great deal of the most decisive and convincing proof of his innocence, in this case, depends on historical and literary contexts. These contexts are specifically the changing times since his death, including both different expectations and knowledge of the Holocaust, that there are three distinct periods of Chesterton's thought concerning the Jews, the context of his own work, for instance, who is speaking in a story, what sort of a book it is, etc., and the era Chesterton lived and wrote in. And within these frames, I intend to focus specifically on Chesterton's views on race, populism, Jewish identity, Disraeli, plutocracy, Zionism, and finally on Chesterton's philo-Semitism. So, but before we can proceed, we must first acknowledge that Chesterton, like any other human being, could occasionally make mistakes. This is not the same thing as being malicious or bigoted. I believe he was wrong about the French Revolution and Napoleon, for example, and thus sometimes excessive in his denunciations of his own country's role in 19th century affairs. Nor am I convinced that World War I was a crusade. And I suggest that in certain cases, which I will address shortly, it was misconceptions such as these which sometimes led Chesterton to positions about Jews which were erroneous or exaggerated, positions which, in some cases, he modified or abandoned later in life. But I emphasize that these positions were the result of misconceptions. They were not a priori prejudices stemming from a hatred of Jews. They are, in fact, very similar to some of his criticisms of 19th century England, which derived from his admiration for the French Revolution and Napoleon. And he was no more a hater of Jews than he was a hater of England, something I have never seen him accused of, even though there is more evidence, such as it is, of Anglophobia than anti-Semitism. So let's begin with the definition of anti-Semitism. I think we can all agree that anti-Semitism is a hatred of Jews, but that hatred can take several forms: racial or ethnic, religious, cultural or social, and finally, beyond these categories, we must also consider the persistent targeting of Jews with unfair or unreasonable criticism. Now, GKC was not a hater of people, as Dale pointed out. I used to think that Chesterton hated the Germans, but the more I read him, the more I came to realize that it was German culture or aspects of it and the modern German state that he hated. It was the same with Islam and the East. He could hate certain ideas, ideologies, movements, and beliefs, religious, political, and aesthetic, but he was not a hater of men. And the better he knew men, the more he was inclined to make allowances even for hateful aspects of their thought, as most famously in the cases of George Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells. Now, I don't believe Chesterton knew many Germans, let alone Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, or Japanese imperialists, but he did know many Jews, and there is every evidence that he loved them, and this is already a good indicator of the improbability of his anti-Semitism. But in matters of such importance, it is best to be thorough, and I intend to examine each of these types, racial, religious, cultural, persistently and unreasonably critical types of anti-Semitism in turn. So in the first place, let's tackle the issue of racism, because it's the thing most people associate with anti-Semitism, and because in GKC's case it is so easily refuted. Racism in its modern, genetically deterministic sense arose in the mid-19th century and was an unholy marriage between the scientism of the Enlightenment, the impact of new biology, and its extension in social Darwinism, and the experience of the imperialist powers of the first of the great technological and to a lesser extent civilizational gulfs that separated these first world nations from their subject peoples. It was a point of view common in some degree to the majority of Westerners for the better part of a century. This list alone, scientism, Darwinism, and imperialism, should be enough for students of Chesterton to recognize the absurdity of identifying him with such a movement. For in this, as in many other respects, G.K. Chesterton stood apart from the currents of his time. Against racism, social snobbery, or any other kind of fundamental discrimination, the whole democracy of Chesterton, in the words of Maisie Ward, his first great biographer, stood in revolt. All men were valuable, all men were interesting, the doctor as much as the barber, the clergyman as much as the farmer. All men were children of God and citizens of the world, unquote. And fortunately, Chesterton has left many passages spelling it out in his own words. Quote, the whole catastrophe of the Great War may be traced to the racial theory. If people had looked at peoples as nations in place of races, the intolerable ambition of Prussia might have been stopped before it attained the captaincy of the South German states. Unquote. Quote, the brotherhood of men is a fact which in the long run wears down all other facts. Unquote. On the subject of Jews, he describes his literary hero Charles Dickens as, quote, a good liberal who would have been horrified at the notion of making a venomous vendetta against one race or creed, unquote. He attacked Hitler for his, quote, compulsory action to keep the breed in an artificial state of bestial excellence, of nosing out every secret of sex or origin, so that nobody may survive who is not Nordic, of setting 100 quack doctors to preserve an imaginary race in its imaginary purity, unquote. He devotes a whole chapter of the end of the armistice to the heresy of race. It is interesting that even here he partially exempts Jews from it as the chosen race, and that, quote, in the Jews it has even a certain tragic grandeur, as of men separated and sealed and waiting for a unique destiny, unquote. And in the same book written after Hitler's rise to power, he describes, quote, the strange staleness which makes the racial religion stink in our nostrils with the odors of decay and as of something dug up when it was dead and buried, unquote. There was little Chesterton hated more than determinism, unless it was deterministic pessimism. Populism. Populism is frequently associated with racism, with reason sometimes. It is often an extension of identitarianism. But in this, as in so much else, Chesterton was unusual, differing decisively both from the Nazi cult of race and from the Disraelian ethnic elitism. Chesterton's populism involved two things: a love of and trust in the common man, and the conviction that every people should ideally have a homeland which they govern for themselves. It is the basis of his absolute democracy and hatred of governing elites and imperialism. Quote, as a Democrat, this is Maisie Ward again, as a Democrat he believed in the ideal of direct government by the people, but obviously this was only possible in a world that was also his ideal, a world consisting of small and even of very small states, unquote. The otherness of Jewish identity. At the time, popular culture tended to single Jews out as odd. In 1909, Max Beerbohm, a friend of Chesterton's, identified stock figures of entertainment in popular comic papers and the music halls, quote, mothers-in-law, hen-pecked husbands, twins, old maids, Jews. Jews, after all, are foreigners, strangers, unquote. Chesterton was aware of such prejudices among the common people. And by the way, this is not a prejudice of Beerbohm's. He's simply reporting on the popular tastes. Beerbohm was not anti-Semitic. So Chesterton was aware of such prejudices among the common people, and without justifying them, wanted at least to account for them. Now, this populism translated logically and pro-Semitically into a lifelong support for the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And it's worth noting that Chesterton's view that Jews should ideally live in their own communities and go back to their own people or a restored homeland is essentially the view underpinning the progressive, quote-unquote, Victorian novelist George Eliot's novel Daniel Deronda, in which a Jewish orphan raised as a Christian in a wealthy home discovers his true identity and goes back to the Jewish community to live in a poor but more authentic lifestyle. And this is a novel invariably viewed as philo-Semitic, which was certainly the author's intention as well. Now, it is not at all unusual in my experience for Jews to deny, for example, that Einstein, Marx, and Mendelssohn were German, that Trotsky was Russian, that Freud and Gustav Mahler were Austrian, that Disraeli was English, even though half of the men on this list hated religion in general and Judaism in particular. They are inconsistently, but understandably, not so pleased to hear non-Jews make the same observation. But I do believe that both Chesterton and many Jews have often implicitly or explicitly exaggerated the extent of Jewish separation from Christian culture. A good example of this, especially in continental Europe, is the case of classical musicians and actors. Here the Jews' frequent role as middlemen placed them in an ideal position to mediate the works of great but mostly Gentile national composers and writers to a largely Gentile public. I suspect that Chesterton's well-known tone deafness impeded his view of the enormously important and overwhelmingly successful role of Jews in enriching local European musical cultures, at least, and in these spheres they were anything but alien. Now, we've come to Disraeli, which I think is the one particularly unlooked at subject in connection with Chesterton. So this I think, is significant. There is, of course, a fundamental sense in which the Jews have been aliens and indeed felt alienated from the central currents of the West since its conversion to Christianity. And however politically incorrect it may be to say it, Chesterton has a real point here. But I should like to take a look at one more instance of a no doubt largely unconscious influence that I feel occasionally colored his view of aspects, at least, of the Jewish question, and one which has been almost entirely neglected hitherto, his interpretation of the character and politics of Benjamin Disraeli. Although he was capable of doing justice to Disraeli's intelligence and imagination, it is certain that he had a more consistently negative view of him than he had of Cromwell or Robespierre, which seems quite strange in a way. In many ways, this seems surprising, as Disraeli's views on English history and society had not a little in common with GKC's, as the following quotations make clear. Quote, "Ancient lineage. I never heard of a peer with ancient lineage. The real old families of this country are to be found among the peasantry." Quote, "It is the plunder of the church that we must seek. It is in the plunder of the church that we must seek for the primary cause of our political exclusion and our commercial restraint. That unhallowed booty created a factitious aristocracy, ever fearful that they might be called upon to regorge their sacrilegious spoil. To prevent this, they took refuge in political religionism. They have continued ever since to govern or powerfully to influence this country. They have in that time pulled down thrones and churches, changed dynasties, abrogated and remodeled parliaments. They have disfranchised Scotland and confiscated Ireland." Unquote. Quote, "Two nations between whom there is no intercourse and no sympathy, who are as ignorant of each other's habits, thoughts, and feelings as if they were dwellers in different zones or inhabitants of different planets, who are formed by different breeding, are fed by different food, are ordered by different manners, and are not governed by the same laws, the rich and the poor," unquote. And it will generally be found that all great political questions end in the tenure of land, unquote. And that great champion of the revival of English agriculture, Sir R. George Stapleton, wrote at the crisis point of World War II, quote, "Disraeli understood the English character and the foundation of its greatness, and he spoke with the voice of England. I would have England turn again to Disraeli for inspiration, for that would mean to return to the land," unquote. So what then were Chesterton's objections? The first thing to bear in mind is that until he was over 30, Chesterton was a radical Gladstonian liberal. He canvassed for the Liberal Party in the elections of 1900 and 1906. Christopher Hollis describes him as, quote, "a disciple, indeed almost a worshipper at the shrine of Gladstone," unquote. He only abandoned his support when the party began to move away from Gladstone's politics, first towards imperialism and then proto-socialism. Now, Disraeli was the great bogeyman of Gladstonian liberalism. Virtually single-handedly, Disraeli renovated the Conservative Party and made it a political force for over 100 years, with a novel appeal that crossed class and religious divisions. While Gladstone insisted that Britain should not be the world's policeman, Disraeli invested the empire with a new glamour. Then there was the arresting way Disraeli saw the political role of the Jews. Russell Kirk will be our guide here. Quote, "The Jews," says Sidonian Coningsby, "are essentially Tories," unquote. Elsewhere, Disraeli elaborates, quote, "They are the trustees of tradition and the conservators of the religious element. They are a living and the most striking evidence of the falsity of that pernicious doctrine of modern times, the natural equality of man." You can tell Chesterton's not going to like that particularly. "They have also another characteristic, the faculty of acquisition. Thus it will be seen that the tendencies of the Jewish race are conservative, their bias is to religion, property, and natural aristocracy," unquote. And Kirk concludes, "The Jewish radical is an anomaly. The traditions of race and religion, the Jewish devotion to family, old usage, and spiritual continuity all incline the Jew towards conservatism. It is exclusion from society which provokes the Jewish revolutionary," unquote. What is more, Disraeli saw Judaism and the church and her foundation as Eastern. Quote, "Asian was his word," unquote, in what one Chesterton hated. Disraeli was prime minister for the first 6 years of Chesterton's life, and in that period, as his last hurrah, he dominated the Congress of Berlin to secure an arrangement favorable to Germany and to Turkey against Russia's interests in the Balkans. Unlike the straight-laced Gladstone, Disraeli was a wit, something like a political cross between Lord Byron and Oscar Wilde. It was he who coined the ubiquitous line that there are three kinds of lies: lies, damned lies, and statistics. And his facetious remarks like "a conservative government is an organized hypocrisy," or "my idea of an agreeable person is a person who agrees with me," provoked a detestation amongst his political adversaries that not infrequently found expression in anti-Semitic jibes. In the words of A.N. Wilson, when Gladstone was roundly beaten in the 1868 election, his wife took it as a defeat of the church by unbelieving Jewry. Quote, "Is it not disgusting, after all Papa's labor and patriotism and years of work, to think of handing over his nest egg to that Jew?" Unquote. Gladstone himself mused, "The provocation offered by Disraeli is almost incredible. Some new lights about his Judaic feeling in which he is both consistent and conscientious have come in upon me," unquote. And the liberal historian E.A. Freeman referred in print to the Jew and his drunken insolence in connection with this election. And when the Queen lunched at Disraeli's country home, he described her as going ostentatiously to eat with Disraeli in the ghetto. But Disraeli was ultimately serious about Christianity and championed the cause of orthodoxy, at least as he understood it. When it was suggested that the professors of all creeds were to belong to one church, but were to retain their own particular opinions, he replied, "What do you mean by a church? I say no creed, no church. How can you have a church without a creed?" And when the liberal Dean Stanley of Westminster complained of the harm done by the enforcement of dogmatic standards, Disraeli retorted, "But pray remember, Mr. Dean, no dogma, no Dean." He was above insular anti-Catholic prejudice, indeed was rather pro-Catholic than otherwise in his early days, and retained a mischievous delight in scoring off the limitations of Anglicanism. Quote, "In a truly religious family, there would always be a Father Coleman or a Monsignor Catesby to guide and to instruct. But a Protestant, if he wants aid or advice on any matter, can only go to his solicitor." Such witticisms did nothing to dispel the skepticism of his political enemies, for whom he remained a Jewish counterjumper, a sophisticated fraud. Indeed, in a culture which saw politics as perhaps the highest calling, a master of the dark arts. When he addressed the dons and undergraduates of Oxford in 1863, who were agonizing about whether humanity was of the apes or the angels, he delivered the famous line, "My Lord, I am on the side of the angels," to which the Gladstonian Chesterton replied in orthodoxy, "He was indeed. He was on the side of the fallen angels." This supposed Luciferian masquerade is probably at play in the duel of Dr. Hirsch, which has been singled out as amongst the most quote-unquote anti-Semitic of Chesterton's stories, but is perhaps more properly seen as an anti-Disraelian parable. When at last it is clear that Hirsch cannot be innocent, Father Brown says that he is not guilty of treason, quote, "No, only of ambition, like Caesar," unquote. As GKC was later to write in the New Jerusalem, "Even if we can bring ourselves to believe that Disraeli lived for England, we cannot think that he would have died for her. If England had sunk in the Atlantic, he would not have sunk with her, but easily floated over to America to stand for the presidency." For the liberals, perhaps the most notorious Disraelian episode of all was Suez. The Suez Canal was of crucial importance to British trade and securities in India and against Russian expansion. 4/5 of its traffic was British, and by 1875 the Khedive of Egypt was ready to sell his shares in the canal for £4 million, but if the money could be raised at once. But Parliament was not in session, so it could only be done by loan. The Prime Minister approached Lionel de Rothschild. Disraeli Secretary Monty Corrie recorded a now legendary account of the transaction. He told Rothschild that Disraeli needed 4 millions on the following day. Rothschild was eating grapes. He took one, spat out the skin, and said, "What is your security?" "The British government. You shall have it." I say legendary account advisedly. Corrie loved a good story, and there's no proof that the narrative is accurate in its details, but there can be no doubt that Chesterton knew it and likely accepted it as true. And one is forcefully reminded of Disraeli's remark that, quote, "The world is governed by very different personages from what is imagined, by those who are not behind the scenes." This celebrated line is delivered in the novel Coningsby by the Jewish character Sidonia, and the full passage is even more significant relative to GKC's depiction of Jews in his fiction. "And is Napoleonic Marshal Soult a Hebrew?" asks Coningsby. "Yes, and others of the French generals, and the most famous, Massena, for example. His real name was Manasseh. But to my anecdote. The consequence of our consultation was that some northern power should be applied to in a friendly and mediative capacity. We fixed on Prussia, and the President of the Council made an application to the Prussian minister, who attended a few days after our conference. Count Arnim entered the cabinet, and I beheld a Prussian Jew. So you see, my dear Coningsby, that the world is governed by very different personages from what is imagined by those who are not behind the scenes," unquote. As it happens, the purported Jewish identity of Soult and Massena is untrue, but in any case, readers of The Flying Inn might remember the following passage. "In all this, Lord Ivywood perhaps appeared more personal in contrast to the man sitting next to him, who never spoke at all, but whose face seemed to speak for him. He was Dr. Gluck, the German minister, whose face had nothing German about it," unquote. So you see, it could be argued that Chesterton derived this trick from none other than Benjamin Disraeli. As Anne Farmer points out, and as I shall have reason to repeat, Chesterton's remarks on the Jews are frequently much more complex than they seem. GKC described Disraeli's politics as a sort of mystical cynicism, and he says of him that, quote, "He did do something in his political novels towards revealing the dishonesty of our politics, even if he had done a great deal towards bringing it about." When one considers that this passage was written at the height of the Marconi scandal, it is both a very serious charge against Disraeli as being close to the fountainhead of the supposed Jewish influence in the corruption of public life, and remarkably restrained in its expression. While Disraeli remains a divisive figure, there can be no doubt that among the many liberals of the late 19th century who took their cues from Gladstone, he deepened the suspicion that assimilated Jews were aliens in disguise. Plutocracy. Chesterton's hatred of plutocracy has often been mistaken for anti-Semitism, but the pro-Semitic Cardinal Manning, in his 1891 review of Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum, condemned, quote, "the plutocracy which has weighed so heavily upon the poor," unquote. GKC's disillusionment with politics began during the Boer War, when he became persuaded that international finance had dragged Britain into an unjust war. The corruption revealed by the Marconi scandal, his brother's conviction for libel, and death a handful of years later cemented his revulsion from mainstream political life. GKC didn't like bankers or financiers, irrespective of their ethnicity. In his comic poem Eskimo's Song, he refers to, quote, "a banker's regrettably painless disease." Since the Holocaust, criticisms of Jewish financial influence have been routinely and retroactively identified as anti-Semitic, at least in their content. But in an interesting recent development, newly published secret testimony given to the Palestine Royal Commission by David Lloyd George in 1937 revealed that the former Prime Minister believed that the Jews were, quote, "a dangerous people to quarrel with, but a very helpful people if you get them on your side. They're a very subtle race, and they have means of communicating throughout the world which nobody seems to know about." He added that, quote, "Jewish financiers in America stopped the U.S. from joining the war during its first 3 years, that's World War I, and said that he sent Rufus Isaacs, who later became Lord Reading, to secure what was then the largest bank loan ever. We sent a Jew over to negotiate our loan, Lord Reading. I do not think anybody else could have done it. There are two people I would not quarrel with if I was running a state. They're both international forces. One is the Jews, he said, while the other is the Catholic Church," unquote. Lloyd George, who was a father figure to mainstream British leftism for most of the 20th century, is not normally associated with anti-Semitism, but he was for this statement. However, Jewish agnostic and Holocaust survivor Hannah Arendt confirms the partial reality of late 19th century Jewish plutocratic influence, though to a more restricted extent and time frame than was widely believed. Quote, "For a very brief time, there was some truth in Jewish Foreign Minister of the Weimar Republic, Walter Rathenau's remark that 300 men who all knew each other held the destinies of the world in their hands, unquote. This was no global Jewish conspiracy of the sort laid out in the fraudulent protocols of the Elders of Zion and ridiculed by Belloc, but Arendt affirms that financiers, mainly Jews, who had fled the Russian pogroms, facilitated the exploitation of South African gold and diamonds, though it was the non-Jewish Cecil Rhodes who persuaded Britain that imperialist force was needed to protect such investments. However, by the 1920s, this was no longer true, as the growing influence of big business on the state and the state's declining need for Jewish services threatened the Jewish banker with extinction. Like Léon Blois, Chesterton's refusal to treat Jews like everybody else was mystical. Both men expected better of Jews and Christians alike because of their high calling. To whom much is given, much will be required. And Blois' view of Jewish financiers might have been GKC's, quote, "In writing a book about the poor man, how could I fail to speak of the Jews? What people is so poor as the Jewish people? Oh, I know very well there are the bankers and the speculators. Legend and tradition would have it that all Jews are usurers. People refuse to believe anything else, and that legend is a lie, and applies only to the dregs of the Jewish community. Those who are familiar with them and look upon them without prejudice know that these people have another side," unquote. And of the poor Jews, Blois wrote, "We are always on the right side when we are with those who suffer persecution," unquote, a sentence Chesterton increasingly made his own in the 1930s. The context of the times, his style, we must always bear in mind when examining the works of Chesterton that we are dealing with times very different from our own, with very different sensitivities, and this is particularly true with regards to the Jews before the Holocaust. In Chesterton's day, England was a much more ethnically and religiously homogeneous culture than it is today, and a more insular one. Until the 1960s, for example, the majority of poorer Britons rarely, if ever, went abroad, even on holiday. Foreigners stood out, particularly to the lower classes, and none more so among the larger minorities than the Jews and the Catholics. Afro-Caribbeans were rare in England before the 1950s. Jews were stock figures of the time. In Wilde's picture of Dorian Gray, for instance, we find, "A hideous Jew in the most amazing waistcoat I ever beheld in my life was standing at the entrance. The horrid old Jew came round to the box after the performance was over. The old Jew stood grinning at the doorway of the dusty green room," etc. Max Beerbohm, who didn't have an anti-Semitic bone in his body, depicted his ethnically Jewish friend, the wit Reggie Turner, with an enormous nose, while Chesterton's friend, the Jewish poet Humbert Wolff, was once caricatured by his Jewish friend, David Lowe, as having a hooked nose even though he didn't have one. Prominent noses indicated Jews even among friends, even among Jewish friends. Any avid reader of Chesterton will be familiar with the flamboyant trappings of his style, a barrier for some and to the rest of us a delight. Chesterton was a natural caricaturist with pen and pencil, and had a pronounced element of the grotesque. In the world of Chesterton's language, it is Mardi Gras every day. In contradistinction to the realists and impressionists who dominated the arts of the first half of his life, his style in writing as an illustration had about it something of the bold symbolism of Blake. As he put it, "I really like to see ideas or notions wrestling naked, as it were, and not dressed up in a masquerade as men and women." So things in Chesterton's fiction are frequently not what they seem with regards to this. One good example is to be found in Man Alive, in the passage of the trial, where Moses Gould says, "Oh, Oli, Oli, Oli." Moses Gould was as good a fellow in his way as ever lived, far kinder to his family than more refined men of pleasure, simple and steadfast in his admiration, a thoroughly wholesome animal and a thoroughly genuine character. But wherever there is conflict, crises come in which any soul, personal or racial, unconsciously turns on the world the most hateful of its 100 faces. English reverence, Irish mysticism, American idealism looked up and saw on the face of Moses a certain smile. It was the smile of the cynic triumphant, which has been the toxin for many a cruel riot in Russian villages or medieval towns, unquote. This passage is in many ways not what it seems. We are likely today to be disturbed by what appears to be a half-justification of the pogrom, in spite of what we know of the rage and disgust the reports of Russian pogroms actually inspired in Chesterton. But we'd be overlooking several things. The detail that any soul as an individual or as a national expression has a particular hateful expression it reserves for crises. This is important as it emphasizes Chesterton's conviction, both of the absolute value of both each individual and each nation, the themes GKC comes back to repeatedly. That Gould is praised above his Gentile fellows for some important virtues, family life, decency, and authenticity, all ranking very high for Chesterton. But perhaps the most surprising thing about it is something which I think is probably not generally noticed, which is that holy, 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 most people would take to be a reference to either to Isaiah or to the Catholic Mass. But holy, holy, holy is actually the high point of the Amidah, which is the central prayer of the Jewish Sabbath service. And I suspect that Chesterton must have known that because he had many Jewish friends, some of whom were practicing. And this remark generally, I think, sort of slips past the observation of most people who read it. Golden Age detective fiction is another place which is worth looking for, analyzing Chesterton's style for complexities. For example, Jews occasionally feature as suspects in Chesterton's detective fiction, which reflects their being suspected in society, but they're generally not guilty. Only one of Chesterton's Jewish villains, Dr. Hirsch, is portrayed as thoroughly bad. Out of 52 Father Brown stories, 11 have Jewish elements. Out of 13 Jewish characters, only 3 are guilty. So that's 3 Jewish culprits in 52 stories. And the percentage is even lower if you add this to his other fiction. And I emphasize that in the detection fiction of this era, Jews were frequently suspects and also frequently guilty. So Chesterton's use of them is in no way unusual. Yes, given the popularity of using Jews as suspects in the detective fiction of that era, that's pretty thin gruel for a supposed anti-Semite. And what's more, it is surely significant that in his last Father Brown collection, The Scandal of Father Brown, published in 1935 after the rise of Hitler, there is only one Jewish character in 9 stories, and he is the murder victim. So, finally, I think I'd like to look at the contemporaries of Chesterton's last phase and see how they stack up with him. A number of famous contemporaries who are not usually associated with anti-Semitism said things which would be seen as rather surprising today. Churchill, in a 1920 article entitled Good and Bad Jews, for example, wrote concerning Bolshevism that, quote, "It was as if the gospel of Christ and the gospel of Antichrist were destined to originate among the same people, and that this mystic and mysterious race had been chosen for the supreme manifestations both of the divine and the diabolical." As late as 1935, Churchill is asking himself whether Hitler is going to be seen in the future as a Pericles and a George Washington, or seen in the welter of the inferno of human scorn with Attila and Tamerlane. Now that's after the promulgation of the Nuremberg laws, which stripped Jews of their citizenship. Churchill said that. He didn't reprint it in the published edition, but it was in the collected edition of his great contemporaries, but it was in the Strand magazine edition. David Lloyd George, in 1933, asserted that if Hitler were overthrown, it would mean the triumph of communism in Germany. In 1936, Lloyd George called Hitler the greatest man in Germany, one of the greatest of the many men I've ever met. He is the George Washington of Germany. He is a born leader of men, a magnetic, dynamic personality with a single-minded purpose, a resolute will, and a dauntless heart. And Lloyd George is never associated with anti-Semitism, for example. In the case of H.G. Wells, in 1939, he writes, "I met a Jewish friend of mine the other day and he asked me, what is going to happen to the Jews? I told him I had rather he had asked me, what is going to happen to mankind? But my people," he began, "that," said I, "is exactly what is the matter with them." And in 1942, Wells, recalling a post-First World War conference in which Israel Zangwill was pleading the cause of a homeland for the Jews, saw fit to recall with approval how Rebecca West had, quote, "listened with a growing impatience to these demands, and suddenly she was inspired to a concentrated expression of our general impatience. 'Mr. Chairman,' she said, 'should I be in order if I moved a pogrom?'" Wells wrote this in 1942, after the Holocaust had actually started. Of course, he didn't know that the Holocaust had started, but one can only imagine what would have happened to Chesterton if he had left remarks like this to posterity. Here is George Bernard Shaw 1 year after Hitler's election. Quote, "There is an extraordinary number of people whom I want to kill. You must all know half a dozen people at least, who are no use in this world, who are more trouble than they are worth. I appeal to the chemists to discover a humane gas that will kill instantly and painlessly, deadly by all means, but humane, not cruel," unquote. He described Stalin's secret police as a body of well-intentioned amateurs. He also said in 1940 to Beatrice Webb, "We are National Socialists, and for socialism in a single country as against Trotsky." He also wrote, "Hitler has the courage of his conviction to a sublime height. Altogether a very remarkable fellow, this Hitler. That's 1942, Shaw. Shaw, quote, liked the idea of gas chambers, boasting that he had thought of the idea before Hitler. And even after the Holocaust, he advocated killing disabled people. Incidentally, Shaw was not anti-Semitic, but nevertheless, he believed in killing other people. So one might ask oneself, why is it all right for David Lloyd George and for George Bernard Shaw and for H.G. Wells to say these things? Their reputations are completely unblemished, especially Shaw's, and not for Chesterton. But in any case, I go on at least for a bit. Chesterton's response to Nazism was rather different. He wrote, "We must feel about Hitler as men felt about Herod, who of course killed Jewish children. When the Nazis say they worship the German God, they really mean that they would not be judged even on the day of judgment by any God who was not a German. But the founder of Christianity and Christendom neglected to make himself a German." Now, the final thing I'd like to advert to is the fact that Chesterton actually wrote a number of things about Jews and Judaism which are hardly mentioned and most arresting in their positive character. He wrote, for example, "If I were a Jew, I would rebuild the temple, though without bothering about the site, as the old site would raise a holy war from Morocco to the marches of China. But seeing that some of the greatest of the deeds of Israel were done, and some of the most glorious of the songs of Israel sung, when their only temple was a box carried about in the desert, I cannot think that the mere moving of the situation of the place of the sacrifice need even mean so much to that historic tradition as it would to many others. That the Jews should have some high place of dignity and ritual in Palestine, such as a great building like the Mosque of Omar, is certainly right and reasonable, for upon no theory can their historic connection be dismissed," unquote. These are not the words of an anti-Semite. How could one identify as an anti-Semite someone who referred to the Jews in these terms? "It is true, humanly speaking, that the world owes God to the Jews," quote unquote. Equally, he referred to his great friends in the Junior Debating Club, half of whom were Jewish. He was the president of the Junior Debating Club, and half the membership was Jewish. I went to Chesterton School, and I can attest to the fact that, yes, there are Jews at St. Paul's, but we're always a minority. It's quite small. So if there were to be a debating club today, for example, that 50% of the club should be Jewish would seem to suggest some kind of favorable disproportion rather than the reverse. In any case, he wrote, where is it? Yes, "No one, we believe, could ever have had better friends than did the hero of this narrative. We wish that we could bring before the reader the personality of all the knights of that eccentric round table." And he refers, amongst other things, to their moral qualities, the same people, another side of the same people, which is the love of home, the love of children, the meek and malicious humor, the tranquil service of a law. "I am no anti-Semite," he elsewhere wrote. "I respect and have the deepest regard for Jews, for their wonderful history, for their wonderful faith, for their remarkably fine qualities, mental and moral. I am no fascist," he wrote in the last year of his life, as opposed to George Bernard Shaw, who during World War II said, "I am a National Socialist." So I think that when all is said and done, it's incoherent to accuse Chesterton specifically of anti-Semitism without accusing some of his contemporaries of that and a lot worse. So one has to ask oneself why that's not the case, and that's a complicated question. It's probably impossible to answer. But there can be no doubt about the fact that some of it is due to ignorance of Chesterton's writings, and ignorance of Shaw's writings as well, for that matter. And some of it is due to prejudice. It's too easy to target somebody who's already being attacked and to allow those attacks to continue if it's convenient because of the corollary effects it will have. I think in this respect, Chesterton has been the victim of consistent injustice. If I were to criticize somebody based even on an observation I'd read somewhere, as was the case, by the way, with H.G. Wells, I used to be under the impression that Wells was anti-Semitic. I have to say that in fairness to Wells, he's not. He was indifferent to the Jews. He didn't care about whether or not they were persecuted. He thought it was stupid. But he was not against persecuting various minorities or groups. and he did not particularly care if the Germans persecuted their Jews. He was a rather cold-hearted man in many ways. But he was not a specifically bigoted man towards the Jews, and so I would retract that statement now. I don't see why it's so difficult for people who make these kinds of statements about Chesterton not to pursue them, to see whether in fact they're substantiated by the text. It's my impression that the more Chesterton you read, the more ridiculous the charges become, or the more ephemeral some of their applications become. It's obvious from context and from detail and from comparison of genres that Chesterton was in no substantial way negative towards the Jews, other than incidentally hurtful, unintentionally hurtful remarks. But in terms of his hatred towards people, as Dale pointed out, Chesterton was not a hater of men of any kind, and certainly not of the Jews. Thank you very much.